In order to preserve freedom at home, America must make an effort to export it abroad. Ha! You've got to be kidding me. In the last 25 years, in the name of spreading democracy and freedom, the U.S. completely destroyed Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Mali, Syria, Iraq again, Yemen, and major parts of Pakistan and Ukraine, killing and getting killed upwards of 4 million people, displacing 40 million more, and spreading terrorism and chaos and reaction all across the Middle East, Central Asia, North and Eastern Africa, and now Eastern Europe as well. You noticed, right, that the U.S. government has shown no interest in spreading democracy to Kuwait, Saudi, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman, or Egypt, because they're Washington's allies. And that when the people vote wrong, like in Algeria, Jordan, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Iraq, Pakistan, Palestine, or Egypt, after they overthrew the last American puppet dictator there, the U.S. will immediately move to intervene with a coup, if necessary, to protect what they consider to be their interests. Liberty and democracy, nothing. Here's what happened to the freedom of the American people during this time. We got 7,000 dead soldiers, along with many tens of thousands more wounded and dead at their own hands. We got the Patriot Act, domestic spying, Department of Homeland Security, including the TSA, so-called fusion centers effectively nationalizing local and state police under federal authority, and also militarizing them with drones, M4s, and APCs, and added training for our local peace officers by ruthless Israeli occupation forces. They launched a massive censorship regime, first against recruitment by the Islamic State Caliphate that they helped to create in Syria and Iraq. Then they turned it right around to censor Americans who dissented against their lies about Russiagate, Ukrainegate, the 2020 election, COVID, and the Ukraine war. The government labeled Americans who dissented against the useless totalitarian COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates as domestic violent extremists as a pretext to investigate and persecute us as terrorists. They'd done the same to conservative Catholics. More than 250 fools have been entrapped into fake terrorism plots generated by the FBI to terrorize your family into supporting more war and more national police authority. Real terrorists have killed innocent Americans in blowback terrorist attacks, including in Little Rock, Fort Hood, Boston, Orlando, San Bernardino, Corpus Christi, and Pensacola. Americans have been subject to severe economic dislocation, leading to mass homelessness and deprivation, caused by unbearable taxation and monetary inflation, which leads to massively higher prices, as well as the catastrophic boom-bust economic cycles that destroy so much wealth and ruin so many lives. With world empire comes a domestic empire that rules and regulates our lives in ways which challenge Chairman Xi's regime's tyranny over the people of mainland China. But as William F. Buckley said back in the 1950s, we are supposed to have to suffer this, quote, totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores, even with Truman at the reins of it all, end quote, in the name of defending mankind from Soviet communism, for us now long gone. Now, my opponent and the rest of the war party demand we sacrifice what little resources, lives, and liberty we have left in the name of taking on every last government on earth outside of America's sphere of influence, invoking the Declaration of Independence all the while. What an unbelievable joke. And what good could possibly come from U.S. government intervention in, for example, China's domestic politics? Even if the U.S. government really believed their own propaganda about just caring so much for the people over there, is it not obvious that any support the U.S. gave the most pro-freedom groups would only serve to discredit them as foreign stooges? What self-respecting Chinese patriot would accept assistance from a foreign state to agitate against his own in the first place? Libertarians believe, as the great Murray Rothbard taught, in universal individual human rights, locally enforced. To call any nation, even our late great one, into the service of humanity is to summon a demon. As John Quincy Adams warned, the U.S. government has become the dictators of the world and the authors of the death of the liberty of the American people, that which they were actually sworn to protect. We would be much better off following the foreign policy of the founders and Ron Paul, and support peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations and stay out of their internal politics. I'd like to say we should just lead by example, but we have a lot of liberty to win back before we can even be an example to anyone, much less the righteous violator of other nations' sovereignty under the excuse that our national greatness makes us so exceptional that other levels of morality become null and void and aggressive war becomes a virtue. And how dare any foreign national come to our country and demand that our greatest enemy, the government, confiscate even more of our money and usurp even more power to itself to solve their problems for them. All the Chinese, Iranian, and other foreign exiles trying to misuse our security forces this way need to listen well. You have no right to our lives or our wealth. Not one son, not 1 cent, none. Take responsibility for your own problems and keep your hands to yourself. For more than a year and a half, the world has watched as America has backed the most criminal regime on the planet, Israel, as it has murdered more than 50,000 people, including thousands of children, and all in the name of exterminating Amalek, some mythological enemy of the ancient Hebrews, whom God supposedly ordered them to eradicate down to the last child. It's a preposterous excuse to murder people and steal their property. And it is an ethnic cleansing campaign committed with the utmost and deliberate cruelty. Under Israel's Da'iya doctrine, they deliberately destroy entire cities and kill entire families. They've bombed the markets, waterworks, electricity, sewage, hospitals, schools, universities, and every last government office holding public records regarding land ownership and family registries, with the declared and explicit purpose of eradicating the Palestinian society and driving the last of them out of the territory. That's why they call it a genocide. Israel uses AI programs to choose which people to kill for them. With an AI bot called Daddy's Home, the computer waits for the human designated as a supposed militant to go home to his family before killing them all. They deliberately killed more journalists than have died in every other war since and including Vietnam combined. Israel kills journalists' entire families, too, as a terrorist message to anyone else who might dare upload video of their other atrocities. They target rescue workers rushing to save dying children with tank fire. They lure starving people into ambushes with promises of food and then machine gun them to death. They deliberately target toddlers and pregnant women with sniper fire. The Israelis shoot and kill Palestinians for, quote, sport, because they are, quote, bored. They bury people alive in the rubble of their former homes. They officially use innocent captives as human shields. They call it the Mosquito Protocol. A senior Israeli military officer said they have a, quote, sub-army of Palestinian slaves, unquote, they force to clear buildings and tunnels, including women, children, and the elderly. They gang rape and torture captives to death in their dungeons. The United States, under the previous administration and the current one, is in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions as well as U.S. law, which forbids material support to war criminals. They are threatening another catastrophic aggressive war against Iran right now. We can either have America first or Israel instead. It's not too late to stop right now. But America still pays Israel's way and provides their jets and bombs. As the Israeli military has said, they literally could not do it without us. And so Americans will continue to be killed by terrorists seeking revenge for U.S. support for Israel's crimes, just like September 11th and so many other attacks since then, including in Washington, D.C. and Boulder just a few weeks ago. These are the saviors and redeemers of mankind, the greatest purveyors of violence in the world today, the U.S. government. We ought to ask them to intervene in other countries more soon. Show me the people in any country, not exiles, who demand that the butchers of Gaza bomb and occupy and overthrow their government for them and set them free. If you can find one, I'll still say forget it. But I might also recommend you see a doctor and check your head.
Mr. Horton, I have a question for you. So, first of all, I'd like you to address the comment made by Wang Dan about the COVID-0 policy and how it ravaged the lives of ordinary Chinese for the duration of almost 2 years. That didn't happen in the U.S. We can complain about foreign policy, but that did not happen domestically anywhere in the history of the United States. My question to you, though, Kosovars love us because of the Kosovo War. Kuwaitis love us because of Gulf War I. A lot of Polish love us because of the Solidarność revolutions beyond the Iron Curtain that we supported. How do you address that line of questioning, that line of argumentation, that there are a lot of people that benefited from our ideas and our support and are lending a helping hand in the case of freedom?
Okay, well, first of all, as to the COVID-19 thing, as everybody in this room knows, that was Anthony Fauci who went around President Obama's order that was to stop doing this gain-of-function research, and he declared an emergency and outsourced it to the Chinese to do it for him. It was an American government program, Eco Health Alliance, the American contractor, USAID, and the CIA. As the great journalist Sam Husseini showed, the Pentagon was up to their eyeballs in this. So yeah, Wuhan is in China, but it was a US government program in Wuhan, China that killed so many millions of people around the world. And our democracy sure didn't prevent that from happening, nor did it prevent so many, especially Democrat, but virtually every governor out of all 50 states tried to emulate Chairman Xi's tyranny, especially the Democrats, tried to achieve somehow zero COVID by locking people in their homes, closing down schools, closing down offices, throwing people out of work by the millions, and all to the benefit of a few connected corporations, in a way, the kind of corruption that you would expect from the Communist Party in Beijing, practiced on all of us here at home. You know, reinforcing the point that we have our own problems to deal. We're far from a society that's perfected itself so much that we have nothing better to do now than to remake the rest of the world. We have dams collapsing and bridges falling down. Literally, last year, I always forget the name of the town where the dam collapsed, and luckily they were able to evacuate the town before the lake washed it away. The United States of America is falling apart, and there's no accountability because the government is so big and out of control. There's just no accountability whatsoever for somebody like Anthony Fauci, who, you know, made the AIDS crisis worse and all kinds of things back in his history and should have been held accountable decades ago and was free to make decisions like continuing gain-of-function research in China and inflict that cost on not just us, but the rest of the people of the world in that way.
Thank you.
And then as far as the Libyans and the Kosovars and the Poles, I noticed you had to skip a few there, but yes, there are weaker nations or powers in the world, or even weaker factions within one country who would very much like the US to take their side against the people that they would like to see overthrown. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're fighting on the side of freedom and democracy and capitalism against cronyism and communism and corruption. And a lot of times when they do these color-coded revolutions, they'll overthrow a legitimately democratically elected former Soviet dissident and install a former KGB guy in his place and support him, just as they did in Romania and in Kyrgyzstan and in other places. So, of course, even as Bill Clinton, the NATO expander himself said, contradicting his actions, the question is not whether Warsaw wants to be in NATO so that America will help protect them from their enemies. The question is whether it's good for the United States of America to pass out war guarantees to countries that are closer and closer to other major powers that might end up causing a war, which is, of course, exactly what is the history of Eastern Europe.
Thank you.
Well, we're already agreed that China ought to stay the hell out of American politics, so of course we should absolutely respect the sovereignty of their country the very same way. Simple as that. Their problems are theirs.
All right, we'll take the first question. Please go ahead and keep it brief if you can.
My question is to Mr. Horton. As I understand your position.
Come closer to the mic.
Closer? Is that better?
Yeah.
My question is for Mr. Horton. Does your position, as I understand it, mean that you would have been in opposition to Lend-Lease by the U.S. pre its engagement in World War II, its operation with the aid and recovery to both Japan and Germany post World War II hostile activities, as well as, I'm referring to the Marshall Plan and its Asian equivalent, as well as the general tenor of the Cold War and being opposition to Moscow? Thank you.
Yeah, well, good question. Now, I gotta admit, I just wrote a book about the new Cold War, and I'm less of an expert on the old one, but Yes, I mean, in fact, it was the end of the Marshall Plan that by Ludwig Erhard in Germany that led to the freeing of market economics in West Germany and the rebuilding really of all of the rest of Western Europe too, rather than the Marshall Plan itself. But I think that essentially building an American empire in order to contain Soviet communism came with secondary effects, such as a war in Korea that killed 2 million people, a war in Vietnam that killed another 3 to 5. Nobody really knows if you count all the Laotians and Cambodians, and then all the Cambodians that died under Pol Pot as a direct result of the Vietnam War, and then support for dictators and autocrats like Suharto, who killed 500,000 Indonesians and Timorese, or support for the right-wingers in Brazil and in Guatemala, and where the coup in Guatemala killed 500,000 people. So the process of waging the Cold War and containing Soviet communism came at an incredibly high cost. And then how did it all come unraveled? It came unraveled when Americans had the Vietnam syndrome, which meant that they didn't have the appetite to contain Soviet communism anymore. And so Zbigniew Brzezinski and Walter Slocum thought it would be funny if, what we do, we give the Soviets their own Vietnam. In other words, instead of containing them, let's encourage them to expand and gain more commitments in Africa, in Latin America, and especially in Afghanistan, which then, as everyone agrees, including me and the Reaganites and the Clintonites too, America's covert war in Afghanistan and support for the Mujahideen and the Arab Afghan army is one of the major causes of the fall of the Soviet Union. That communism is a really terrible way to run an economy, and the more responsibilities they took on, the more impossible it ultimately became to maintain it. So maybe without containment, we'd have won the Cold War against the Soviet Union long before, just by demonstrating the superiority of freedom and free market economics.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yes, the topic of this panel is exporting freedom. Along that vein, could you comment on the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of economic sanctions placed by the U.S. on foreign countries? Specifically, if you could comment on the effectiveness of the sanctions against Cuba for the last 6 decades. Thank you.
Take it away, Scott, and just be...
Yeah, in almost all cases, sanctions fail to achieve the stated ends of the politicians. Now, there's a recent example where the sanctions regime against Syria helped lead to the fall of the secular state and the rise of an al-Qaeda state in its place. So that's a great success story. Strangling the people of Iraq for 10 years after Iraq War I failed to result in a regime change, but it did result in hundreds of thousands of excess deaths that motivated terrorists to knock our towers down. So there's a lot of failure built into these things. And as far as Cuba, I mean, just look at it. The Cold War against Cuba, even after the Castros, are both dead and gone. And they still have this commie regime, which still is essentially Marxist in government ownership and control of everything in the country, essentially a totalitarian state to this day, more than 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's absurd. It has to be the case that a Ron Paulian foreign policy, where we just encourage them without the hypocrisy of the intervention, but just did the right thing as best as we could to encourage openness and trade, it almost certainly would have worked better than the tactics that they've used thus far, which you might even think were designed to help protect communism in Cuba and prop it up and prevent the rest of the world from breaking it open again. What might H-bomb-armed Beijing do in response to a sincere attempt by the United States to overthrow their regime? Either definitely nothing, or a price definitely worth paying by you and me, so that they can have a wonderful democratic system just like ours, right? Don't you believe it? America made friends with China 50 years ago. Deng Xiaoping and the reformers turned the country away from Marxist economics soon after. Do they have a one-party authoritarian state? Yes, but so do we, for anyone with eyes to see. And in many ways, their economy, especially for small businesses, is said to be much freer than our own, with 1 million fewer mandates, regulations, and taxes than Americans face here at home. Should they invade to set us free, or are their problems theirs and ours ours? Our interests do not always align, but there's no reason our civilization and China should be enemies, all the whining and lobbying by their exiles notwithstanding. As Machiavelli warned, quote, "As for the empty promises and delusive hopes with which exiles set before you, so extreme is their desire to return home that they naturally believe many things which are untrue, and designedly misrepresent many others, so that between their beliefs and what they say they believe, they fill you with false impressions, on which if you build, your labor is in vain, and you are led to engage in enterprises from which nothing but ruin can result." End quote. Mr. Dan, now that you're in the land of opportunity, maybe you should just get a real job and leave foreign policy to those of us who are actually from America and have a long-term interest in its future. Or maybe you should go back home to China and try to do your own people some good without causing harm to mine.